The house had the kind of quiet that announced money the moment it entered a room. The hush of expensive air, the gentle undercurrent of systems, soft closed doors, a distant fridge that never hummed loud enough to be noticed, a fireplace that kept the world at bay. Ava stood near the hearth, palms damp against the edge of a leather chair, and for a long instant, everything in her rehearsed speech felt small. She had practiced what she would say on the walk over from the servants' entrance. Facts first, no begging. The kind of request that could be made like a bill, not an appeal. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Mr. Hale, I need money for a deposit. It's urgent. My mother, she's been denied surgery until the account's cleared. They won't schedule it without the hold. Midnight is the cutoff." Richard Hale was as calm as his estate. He had the posture of someone who had grown used to decisions being simple equations. Risk, return. He had never before had his equilibrium broken by the texture of a hand or the smell of someone else's desperation. In the lamplight he was all control, the motions of his fingers betraying nothing. Then he looked at her hands. There was a smudge of red at the heel of her palm, half wiped away. It might have been paint, he first thought, some domestic accident. Up close he saw skin broken, a small but clear bruise at the wrist where a coarse cuff had struck, and the corner of her apron stained darker than fabric should be at night. He did not expect the plea to feel like a raw thing in the quiet of his living room. He did not expect to be the one who noticed the blood. Ava kept her face level. She had been trained, by necessity, to carry urgency without theatrics. They said if it's not paid, they can't operate. She stopped. The words crowded at the edges and then retreated. The sentence was unnecessary. Richard's eyes kept moving, calculating something beyond charity. The ineffable responsibility that clung to wealth when it met a single, unavoidable human need. There was a long beat of the kind that stretches thin in great houses, where servants are supposed to be steady props, and emergencies are meant to arrive through the right channels. Ava felt the house pressing at her back, the polished floor, the muted rug at her shoes, the painting above the mantel that looked down with a composure she was not afforded. The door opened before anyone else could say more. Elaine Hale entered like a temperature change, cool, precise, an armor of silk and invention. Her shoes made deliberate assertions on the marble. Her greeting was a practiced blade, polite in wording, dismissive in tone. "Ava," she said, "is there a reason you're still awake?" The question was a reprimand dressed as curiosity. Ava inhaled and answered with the truth. "My mother needs a deposit at the hospital. They hold surgery unless it's paid. It's tonight, Mrs. Hale. Midnight." Elaine's expression folded in a way that could have been concern if anyone believed it was for the right person. Instead, she turned that concern into a method, the rapid, public reduction of someone into a single solvable problem that made the rich comfortable again. "This is highly irregular," she said. "This house runs on rules." Ava put her hands where they could be seen. She refused to shrink. "I don't have it. I'm asking—" Elaine cut her off with a thin laugh that had the sound of a verdict. "You don't ask that here," she said. There was a chill in it that named something ancient about class and distance. She stepped forward, too close. Her fingers brushed Ava's apron, almost professionally inspecting the stain, and the gesture felt like a possession. "You must remember your place." It was not a slap. It did not have to be. Elaine shoved, the motion quick, public, a reminder of control. Ava stumbled. The room inhaled. The servant's door at the far end of the hall made no sound. The house watched without responding. A single white heel scraped the stone like a punctuation. Ava took a step back, palms open to show she was not a threat. Richard's face did the thing it had been designed to do in public. Nothing. Privately, his chest crowded. Annoyance, a flash of heat that had nothing to do with sympathy. He watched the small incision of humiliation and felt, without understanding entirely why, the arrangement of his world shift. Elaine had misread him. He had been listening. "You will leave," Elaine said, and the words were not merely to Ava. They were to order the room back into the pattern where nobody disturbed the air with need. Now. Ava's voice had lost nothing of its clarity but gained a new edge. "My mother could die if it's not paid," she said. There were no tricks here. There was only the ledger of fact. Care required money. Midnight required cash. Elaine's jaw hardened. "We'll call security," she said. "You're on thin ice." When the security man, young, apologetic, arrived, he did not touch her forcibly. There was no theater. He guided her by the elbow with an efficiency that made it clear the house preferred things to happen without scenes. Ava walked through the corridor, past portraits that had watched centuries of class speak and obey, and she felt every eye as if it was an accusation. Out in the servants' entrance, in the alley that smelled of exhaust and yesterday's takeaway, her phone buzzed with the hospital's number. She answered with hands that had lost the warmth of the hale hearth. "They told me," she said to the woman at the other end, who used medical phrases like a second language. "They said the surgeon will not move forward without the deposit. It's a hold. By midnight." "You can come now," the woman said. "We'll hold it for a few hours, but we need authorization and the deposit. If you don't have it, we can put in an emergency aid request, but with the wait, it may push past today." Ava closed her eyes in the alley until the noise of the night returned. The city had no interest in rhythm here. Its sounds were practical things. The hiss of a bus pulling up, the clack of boots, a distant siren that could mean anything. She thought of her mother's small breath in the phone image she carried in her head. Frail, chin tucked, a thin bruise of color under an eye where the laundromat had struck against her for years. The laundromat. The long steam and the heat, the caustic smell that never left the fabric after a 12-hour day. The accumulation of a life that had been made efficient for other people's clothes. Ava had been saving, always quietly, a few dollars folded at the back of envelopes. Enough for bus fare, enough for a week's groceries, never enough for the sudden arithmetic of medicine. Tonight, those savings were a small and inadequate island. "If I don't have it tonight," she told the hospital, "we'll lose the slot." She hung up and found a bus that would take her across town. The ride felt like a long-held breath. Her mind rehearsed the sentence again and again, simplifying it until it was a blunt fact she could carry. Deposit, midnight. Whatever dignity Elaine had tried to strip away in the Hale dining room had not removed the thing that made Ava stubborn. A refusal to let another person be erased in a system that valued records and receipts over bodies. She knew that asking the house for money would be scandal. She had known that from the first 5 minutes she had worked there. People like her were never supposed to cross the threshold where their needs named someone's discomfort. And yet, standing at the servants' entrance with the city cold at her back, she allowed herself the audacity of hope. Halfway across the river, the house announced itself in the newspapers and in the ironed linens of charity galas. The world pressed around Richard like a curated package. He had old men on his board who liked to bloom into bulldogs when the press came near, and young analysts who smelled risk in a whisper. In his private room, he read but did not yet act. The message about the maid's request arrived not as a headline but as a small note in his assistant's tablet. Ava Johnson, domestic staff, requested funds to cover a medical deposit tonight at St. Mary's. Urgent. He stared at the line and felt irritation at the way small things demanded disproportionate attention in a life that was otherwise predictable. Then he remembered the smear of red on the hand he had seen in the living room, a mark he couldn't place except to know it was not his. Something about that image did not sit right. He ordered a car. From Ava's perspective, the city blurred into sterile corridors. The hospital waiting room was a glass aquarium of human fears. A man who cupped his knee as if the pain might not exist until someone saw it. A teenager on a phone who kept laughing in bursts. A nurse who navigated the room like an island of calm. Ava perched on a vinyl chair with the stubbornness of people who had learned to wait their turn because there was no other way. The clerk behind the counter was apologetic but firm. "We need a deposit to schedule the operating room," she said. "There are paperwork steps, and without it the surgeon can't guarantee the time. Our triage holds until midnight, then we release the slot." Ava's hand found the corner of the form to thumb. "Is there any emergency assistance?" she asked. "We have a charity fund," the clerk said, but her voice carried that same institutional rhythm. "Applications, verification. But that process can take time. Time. Midnights are arbitrary things until they become the only thing that matters." Ava called her mother on the bench by the window. The line connected, a voice thin with sleep and fear, the kind of voice that has been corralled by years of being expected to bear pain quietly. "They say they can do it tonight if—" Ava began, and then the words frayed. Her mother, with a clarity born of many nights of worry, finished. "Then go. Don't let them tell you they can't." On the other side of the city, Richard's driver found a short route that bypassed the valet and syruped through side streets like a shadow. He had no particular plan beyond the odd compulsion to follow a line he did not yet name. His legal counsel, Martin Lewis, reached him before the car pulled into the hospital's drive. Martin's voice was efficient. "If you enter this, you're entering publicity. If it's a loan, make sure it's documented. If it's a gift, know the tax implications. If it's not documented, it will come back as a story." Richard listened until Martin's words became background. He thought of his mother, who had once, when he was child-sized, taught him how to sew a loose button. She had not taught him how to live with power. She had taught him how to make small things hold. He stepped into the fluorescent light of the hospital lobby where someone had smeared fingerprints on the marble like small confessions. Ava was there, a shape at the end of a long row of chairs, talking too loudly into a phone, shoulders taut. There was no theatricality in what he felt, only the quiet, significant annoyance of a man who discovered a moral obligation late at night. He approached as a stranger might, the way one approaches a problem one intends to solve. Ava did not recognize him at first. Faces merge in hospitals into a palette of personal crises. But then their eyes met. The faint recognition of someone who had seen him on television, at galas, a man who wore wealth like a geometry. Her posture changed, an old reflex of propriety folding into place. She had not come tonight to be pitied, to be managed, or to be paraded. She had come to pay a debt that would buy time. He spoke first, his voice low enough not to gather attention. "I understand you need money for a deposit." She wanted to say no, to hold her dignity like a small, warm thing. It would have been simpler to refuse and continue to conduct the rest of her life in the private economies she had developed to survive. Instead, she matched his steady with truth. "Yes, if I don't." Richard looked at the form in her hand, at the entry for the surgery, at the midnight clause. The hospital staff watched with mild curiosity. This might turn into a scene, or it might vanish into the bureaucratic night. His assistant stepped forward in the way assistants do to make other people's lives more efficient. A card here, a name there. He waved her instruction away. He did the only thing he could think of without constructing a narrative about who he was. He called the hospital's admissions and asked to verify the hold. The woman who answered used professional cadence, names, ID numbers, the machine-like rhythm of administrative truth. He asked about the conditions of the deposit. He asked how long the slot would be held. He asked what documentation was necessary to process the payment. She answered everything and used words that had the weight of a procedure. He did not ask to be thanked. When he said, "Wire the deposit as a loan to Ms. Johnson," he framed it deliberately. He wanted the language to preserve the agency of whoever received it, to avoid charity as spectacle. "Document it," he told his assistant later when there was paperwork to be written. "Make sure it's clearly a loan." Martin's caution echoed in his head. Documentation, liability, publicity. Ava's face when he offered the arrangement registered something larger than relief. It was a complex expression, recognition of power, of scale, and an immediate reassertion of her own personhood. "I don't want charity," she said softly. "If it can be a loan, I'll pay you back when I can, but I need it tonight." There was a small human bargaining that happened then. Money framed as debt instead of pity, both trying to keep the other safe. Richard nodded. "I'll make the transfer now," he said, "and I'll come to the waiting room, if you'll allow it." Ava considered the offer. She had been taught to refuse proximity from patrons. She had been taught that the wealthy brought pity and the small talk that erased the underlying urgency. But a life hanging in the balance argued for breaking rules. "If you come," she said, "sit in the corner. Don't make a show of it." He agreed. She did not want the world to be remade around the spectacle of her need. She wanted a deposit to be a deposit, cast informality, a tick in the hospital's ledger that converted human need into a queue that could be honored. When the transfer landed, an instant in a world that trafficked in patience, Ava felt the numbers rearrange the room. The clerk at admissions typed the confirmation in a way that made it reductive and real. "We'll get her in," the clerk said, "but the surgeon needs to see consent forms and we have pre-op checks." The wait was an assembly of small wills. Ava paced between the coffee machine and the window, her hands busy in the human way of people who could not sit still. She spoke to the nurse and filled out forms with a trembling steadiness that had become familiar after a lifetime of filling out what others needed of her. She signed. The pen left an arc of ink that looked for a second like possibility. Richard sat in the corner as she had requested. He watched the fluorescent light cut across the floor and tried to imagine what it was like to be required to explain the texture of one's life in paperwork. He had never had to explain it. His life was a ledger that others balanced for him. The contrast was not new, but seeing it close up changed the way his stomach tightened. They did not speak much. When they did, it was in short rigs of language that strangers use when an empathy is forced into small courtesies. He brought her a cup of hospital coffee because he could see she was cold. She refused milk, took a bite of a sandwich he did not know how to choose, and watched the automatic doors where things arrived and left. The doctor's voice in the corridor had the kind of clarity that made fear concrete. Dr. Lawson explained the surgical risk in broad strokes, the kind of directness that doctors learn to carry because it's kinder than uncertain consolation. "We'll make every effort," he said. "We need to move quickly. The deposit holds an OR time. If we miss it, the next availability is uncertain." He did not say everything. There was no need. The surgery would be serious. The recovery would be long and may require changes to the patient's living arrangements. He was candid where it counted and procedural as the hospital required. As pre-op picked up, someone shuffled through Ava's bag for a list of medications. A nurse rattled off questions. Allergies, last meal, previous procedures. Ava answered like someone reading a ledger. When the final signature was required, she pressed the pen down and felt the weight of the ink right into the paper like an oath. Richard watched her sign. There was a private, immeasurable accounting happening in him. This was not a publicity stunt. There were no cameras in the corners, no grand announcements. There was, instead, a small human transaction and the quiet arithmetic of doing the right thing. He had done a calculation and accepted some cost. Reputational friction, a little inconvenience, the matter of terms. He framed the gift as a loan because in the ledger of his life, loans were more respectable, and because he wanted to keep Ava's self-respect intact. Outside the pre-op doors, Elaine's world shimmered with indignation rehearsed in silk. News of the exchange moved through the house like a rumor. A woman in a blue suit arrived at the hospital later, lines at the corner of her mouth sharpening into a practiced frown. She called Martin and left a message that the Hale name should not be used in public charity without consultation. It was the language of someone who treated reputation like a living thing that needed tending. Her voice on the phone had a controlled edge. "Make sure this is handled," she said. "We can't have stories." But tonight the story was not hers to shape. The operating room clock was a dull instrument somewhere behind the automatic doors. It blinked minutes like an indifferent measure. Ava sat in the hard chair and, for a moment, let the edges of her life be reassembled into a single line. Deposit paid, consent signed, mother prepped. The imminence did not remove her worry about what came after. Who would take care of her mother when she couldn't return to the laundry? Who would pay for rehabilitation or the medicines that would make life possible again? She had not expected to think about labor rights in the waiting room. But necessity makes categories real. The laundromat where her mother had worked was a place of steam and chemical smell and small economies that eroded human bodies over years. She had seen the manager's memos hidden behind invoices that suggested cost-saving measures. She had seen employee complaints accumulate like dust. The thought of her mother returning there with a body that would now need rest and careful attention made her stomach coil. There was time enough at the edges to plan before the surgeon called. She used it not to ask for more help, but to build a plan that took no one's permission, make the call to friends, find out what benefits might be available, talked to the clinic social worker about discharge planning. She told the social worker about the laundromat in a voice that did not beg but reported. "It's not safe for her to return to that job," she said. "There were chemicals in the cleaning supplies. Staff were told to use less protective gear to save money. My mother worked nights to afford rent." The social worker took notes and used phrases like "we can open a case" and "community resources," the institutional language that turned narrative into paperwork. Ava's words fell into the boxes the system provided: complaint, incident, risk. She filled them with steady hands. Richard listened to a piece of the conversation and felt a tide rise in him that demanded more than a deposit. He also felt a new, deep worry. If the laundromat's cost-saving measures had a pattern, if the complaint sounded like the first note of a chorus, then the responsibility might run deeper than a single set of numbers. He thought about the X's on his board's annual reports labeled vendor oversight and wondered how long such labels had been used to ignore real damage. Before the surgeon called the patient into pre-op, a small drama of protocol found them. Additional consent forms, a requirement that next of kin be listed. Ava named herself. The nurse looked at her name, and the hospital recorded it in its systems. There was a bureaucratic sanctity to the moment. To be listed is to be counted. Ava felt the simple validation of official recognition. It did not erase years of invisibility, but it changed the record. When the surgeon took her mother through the double doors into the very white light of pre-op, everything shortened into a soundscape of beeps and small wheels and the rustle of paper gowns. Ava slipped her hand into the pale, familiar hand and felt the tremor that belonged to a life lived in other people's laundry rooms, not hospital beds. The clock on the wall slid toward midnight. Inside his car, Martin Lewis called Richard back. "Document everything. Make sure the transfer shows as an asset to Ms. Johnson. If anything else appears, if the laundromat shows negligence, you need counsel, and you need to limit involvement to documentation and cooperation. Don't publicly take credit. Don't publicly—" Richard said nothing for a long moment. Then he answered in the kind of sentence men like him use when they choose constraint over a spectacle. "We document. Also, I'll speak to Dr. Lawson quietly. We need to understand any evidence of workplace negligence. If there is a pattern, we should address it. Not for show, but for the record." It was a small admission. Not a hero's speech, but a procedural maneuver that promised accountability. Martin would later call it reckless. Others would call it inevitable. For now, it was a decision made in a hallway of fluorescent light. A transfer coded, a presence offered, a willingness to open a file. Ava watched her mother roll away, then turned and met Richard's eyes. The hospital was loud and small at once. The world reduced to tiled floor and a clock. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He shrugged, a small human move that tried to be modest. "You asked," he said, and it was right. She allowed herself a faint private laugh, the sort that tasted like exhausted relief. "Right doesn't pay the bills," she replied, and the corners of her mouth did not hide that she knew it. "It just helps the heart stop skipping for a few hours." They both sat then in the quiet, the way people do when an immediate emergency has been soothed into a temporary settlement. Around them, life arranged itself into trays and forms and the clatter of hospital shoes. Richard made a call and asked the admissions to send confirmation of the transfer to his assistant. Ava called her sister to tell her the news without embellishment. At some point in the long span between surgery preparation and the actual operating time, the house's machinery moved. Elaine's voice returned to the background like a seasonal wind. She wished the arrangement had been handled differently. She wanted the world to be ordered in such a way that nothing unconsidered would brush its edges. She composed a message about propriety and sent it to Martin. "We cannot be associated with impulsive acts," she wrote. "We must protect the name. But the thing about need is that names do not always obey order. They press, they arrive, they insist." The surgeon's assistant appeared at the door to the waiting room with a small clinical smile that meant something essential. They were ready. "We'll take her now," he said. "You can come back in an hour." Ava rose as if she had been wound. The nurse led her past the sliding doors where pre-op smelled faintly of antiseptic and the nervous hush of people clutching things that had once been ordinary. A sweater, a rosary, a photograph. She felt Richard's hand brush the back of her neck once, a quick and accidental reassurance. He did not make a show of being there. He simply existed in the space the way a wall might, solid and present. Ava turned at the door. Midnight was a line behind which the world reconfigured itself. She steadied her breath. She had asked for a small loan to save one life. The loan had been given, but the exchange did not end her story. It opened a ledger that would need footnotes and witness statements. It tangled her life into papers and procedures she had no experience with, but it also placed her firmly in the light. For the first time, the record would show her name in a room where people wrote things down. The surgeon's doors swallowed her mother, and the small procession disappeared into the bright corridor beyond. The clock kept moving, indifferent but precise. In the waiting room, the beep of a monitor in a far corner went on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Ava sat down again, hands folded like keys. Richard watched her, and in his private calculation he had already started to add things on both sides of the ledger. He had placed a line item tonight and asked that it be recorded. He had also set in motion an impulse, a quiet, methodical thing, to ask questions about the laundromat and the conditions that might have brought this pair of women into his living room at midnight. He knew that asking could complicate his life in ways that a night's generosity could not anticipate. Outside the window, the city leaned into midnight. For a moment, Ava allowed herself to imagine simple endpoints. Surgery successful, mother resting, the laundromat forced to change its practices. Then practicalities reasserted their gravity. Who would pay for recovery? How would they navigate the aftercare? Where could her mother rest while bills were being rearranged? She would not be content with a single ledger entry. That had been the lesson of a life stitched with small humiliations. The problem would reappear unless the structure that created it was made different. For now, she thought, there was only the present. The operating room would take the next hour. The clock's minute hand made its slow, inexorable arc. Ava pressed her thumb against the call button and let herself be counted on the hospital's record. Her decisions had set the evening in motion, to ask, to ride the bus, to stand in the alley and make her need into speech. Each choice carried consequences she did not yet fully understand. She had refused the house's humiliation, refused to leave without the truth being known. She had accepted a loan on terms that preserved both her dignity and reality. She had, for the first time in a long while, entrusted a stranger with a number that could mean survival. As the hour tightened, a nurse returned with an update. The surgeon was running slightly behind, but everything looked good so far. The words were technical and measured and somehow felt like a fragile bridge. Ava's phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she did not know. Heard about your courage. If you need anything when she's out, call. The message could have come from a neighbor, a passerby, an activist. It might be kindness or a scam. Ava let it rest, unread, and instead focused on the rhythm of the lights and the low murmur of people waiting for unknown verdicts. In the corner of the room, Richard folded and unfolded a hospital magazine. He had no certainty that tonight would change anything beyond one life secured from immediate danger. But he had a growing conviction that details matter. The laundromat's invoices, a manager's memo, a nurse's note. He had no intention of taking a bow. He only intended to ensure this was documented, to make sure what had been invisible would now be visible. When the surgeon finally emerged into the waiting room, his face had a kind of professional gravity. He used the language of medicine that is both blunt and careful. Surgery went as anticipated, he said. We were able to address the immediate issue. We have to plan for longer recovery. We'll need to monitor her for a few days. Ava exhaled so sharply it felt like a small confession. Her knees, which had been ready to buckle for hours, steadied. She rose to follow the porter down the corridor to the recovery area, and Richard rose with her as if out of reflex, not out of show. Outside, the city persisted in its indifferent hum. Inside, life had been given a little more time. Ava's first decisions had mattered. There would be more decisions to come. She had asked for a loan to save one life. The loan had been given, properly documented and framed. But as she walked the slick hospital tile behind the stretcher that carried her mother, A new thought lodged in her. Survival was not enough. Surviving without change meant the laundromat would still run poorly lit, still cut corners. It meant another family would stand at another marble threshold and ask for air and be told to leave quietly. She pushed the idea away for now because there were forms to sign and a mother to hold. But the seed had been planted. The night had rearranged her life into a different order. She had not come to be invisible. She had come to demand a record. At the doorway to the recovery room, the nurse gave them a small, clinical look of companionable fatigue. "You'll be able to see her shortly," she said. "We'll bring her out as soon as she's stable." Ava positioned herself so she could touch her mother's hand when she came to. She thought of the laundromat's back room, of the drum machines and the steam, and the way the manager shrugged at safety memos because they cost money. She thought of the years her mother had given to other people's schedules, and how those years had slowly taken a toll. The thought hardened into resolve. When the bed rolled in and her mother opened her eyes, Ava leaned in and whispered without ceremony, "I asked for help. They agreed. We got the time." Her mother's fingers were thin, but they closed around Ava's palm in the way of someone rediscovering a familiar harbor. She did not have the strength to speak. She smiled instead, and the thinness of that smile held everything: gratitude, worry, and a will to live. Richard watched them, then took a small step back into the quieter corner of the room. He had done a thing that had to be accounted for, both in his books and in his conscience. He had also stepped into a new set of questions: vendor oversight, workplace safety, the quiet patterns that turned labor into harm. He would talk to Martin. He would set meetings. He would insist on documentation. He knew what his board would call governance. He also knew that governance without courage is just boxes checked on reports. For Ava, the immediate crisis had been momentarily calmed. For Richard, something had shifted, a private sense that paper could not be the last word. For Elaine, the evening had been a breach she would have to correct. The house, that great machine of inheritance and order, would not be quiet about the disturbance. But in the recovery room, with a hospital bracelet around her mother's thin wrist and the clock's hands moving past midnight, the matters of reputation and repair were a horizon yet to be crossed. Ava pressed her cheek to her mother's and let exhaustion and relief wash over her in equal measure. She had asked for a small loan to save one life. She had received it, not as a gift-sundering agency, but as a recorded debt that kept her dignity intact. Outside the window, the city kept its indifferent orbit. Inside, two women and a stranger moved into the difficult work of ensuring that a single night did not end as the final ledger entry of a life's worth of neglect. The rest of the story, Ava knew in the gut that had learned to hold worry like a compass, would require more asking, more records, and unyielding refusal to be erased. For now, she breathed in the sterile air and tasted the small, decisive fact of survival. The clock on the wall ticked on. The first days after surgery felt like walking through fogged glass. Everything was visible but softened, edges blurred, each step requiring more attention than usual. Ava learned the rhythms of the recovery ward, the way the tray carts squeaked at dawn, how nurses measured pain on a scale that tried to turn anguish into numbers, how insurance clerks spoke in polite refrains about coverage and copays. Her mother slept most of the time, small breaths marking progress. Machines kept a patient beat in the corner. Visitors came and left with the discreetness of people who did not want to make burdens. Even as the immediate danger receded, the rest of the world began to make its ordinary demands. Ava filled out discharge forms with a mechanical steadiness. She met the social worker more purposefully now, talking about physical therapy, about how to afford a few days of home care. "We'll set up home health," the social worker said, "and we can open a case for occupational safety if you want to pursue it." Ava did want to pursue it. She went from quiet survival to a focus that felt like a marshalling of small forces. Call lists, witness names, dates and times. She wrote down the manager's initials, the nights her mother had reported rashes, the words the supervisor had used about cutting costs. It was not a sudden transformation into something she had not been. It was, instead, the natural response of someone who had been counted out her whole life and decided the record needed amending. The first official ripple appeared the morning a hospital clerk handed her a small envelope with photocopies, a list of entries from the emergency room notes, timestamps, who had called and when. A pink slip noted that an occupational exposure report had been filed. The nurse at her mother's bedside, who had come with the pragmatic compassion of someone used to people who could not always advocate for themselves, sat carefully on the end of the bed and said, "This is how it starts. Keep everything, names, dates, nothing too neat. Messier is truer." Ava read the stack of papers as if they were maps. She wrote down numbers. She cataloged emails she had been too exhausted to notice, and she began to make the first of several choices that would steer the rest of the story, refused to let the incident be smoothed out. Before she knew it, the Hale household had become a background hum. Calls, terse messages, an insistence from Martin that any next step must be properly managed. Elaine's displeasure filtered through attorneys and assistants in sharp, curated notes about propriety and the possible damage of unauthorized publicity. But it was not only the Hales who were speaking. Dr. Lawson, who had been frank in the operating room, now offered a different kind of assistance. He put Ava in touch with Claire Evans, a patient advocacy representative who worked with the hospital and neighbor nonprofits to guide families through systems that were indifferent by design. Claire arrived at the hospital with an easy competence and a pen that moved fast. She had a way of looking at documents and finding the seams where truth slipped through. "We can help you collect statements," she said simply. "We can file an occupational safety complaint, and we can help with local legal resources for the civil side if you decide to pursue that. But we need your consent to act. Are you willing?" Ava paused. The question felt like another small litmus. Would she continue to make decisions on her terms? The answer was a choice she had already been edging toward all night in the waiting room. "Yes," she said. "I want it all in the record. I don't want a check in a hush." Her voice was steady. The nurse's tired eyes showed something like approval. That refusal, to be bought, to be silenced, was the second decision that would shape everything that followed. Word spread predictably, and not all of it kind. Elaine's network of operatives moved quickly. A PR firm sent an offer of discreet assistance. An assistant called with a proposed settlement letter that would include a lump sum, immediate relocation assistance, and a standard non-disclosure agreement. The envelope smelled faintly like civility. Martin, the cautious counsel who lived in clauses, delivered the offer with the clinical detachment of an accountant. "It's standard," he said. "It protects both parties. It would keep the story from going public. It would limit your exposure to stress and deposition." Ava looked at the page without flinching. The measure of money was there, enough to cover bills for months perhaps, but she had learned to read price tags for more than their dollar signs. She slid the paper back across the table. "I won't sign that," she said. The sentence landed like a small declaration. "If what happened to my mother could happen to someone else, I won't be quiet." Martin sighed as if she had inconvenienced the machinery of containment. "There are risks," he said. "Publicity can be corrosive. It can be used against you. Depositions, delays. It's messy." Ava's next decision felt less romantic to herself than it might have looked to others. She was tired of being polite about exhaustion. She had no illusions about a courtroom turning everything into simple justice. She knew processes were slow and that legal wins were rarely instantaneous. Yet she also knew that silence could be worse. It allowed the pattern to continue. She signed the paperwork, granting Claire authority to gather statements and to coordinate an occupational complaint. She agreed to meet with an attorney the hospital recommended for victims of workplace exposure. She accepted nothing that would make her invisible. That acceptance set loose a procedural chain. Claire began to gather records. The hospital's compliance department logged Ava's complaint and pulled the laundromat's contract file. In quiet office rooms with blinking lights and endless folders, someone typed vendor review and attached the laundromat's invoices. A string of memos surfaced, cost-saving directives that had cropped up the previous year, emails with curt subject lines like PPE budget and reduce overhead. Compliance flagged a set of unclosed incident reports in the laundromat's personnel file. Workers had complained about fumes and improper use of chemicals. but the complaints had been filed in a manner that kept them from triggering immediate action. Richard's internal review, which he had requested with the careful language of someone trying to stay procedural, found its first evidentiary bones in those memos. He read them late one night in a secure room, a stack of prints in front of him. The memos were not dramatic on their face. They were unremarkable in tone, the kind of corporate efficiency that has no mercy. But one link mattered. The Hale Company had a vendor oversight policy that, on paper, required random audits and incident follow-up. The actual practice, it seemed, had been outsourcing oversight to a lower rung of contractors who treated safety as an option rather than a mandate. When he brought the findings to Martin, the attorney's face tightened into familiar lines. Legal exposure, reputational risk, shareholder alarm. If we proceed, we document. If there's negligence, we cooperate or we face escalation. If you don't cooperate now, it will look like obstruction. Richard heard the words the way a man hears the echo of a bell. He had made a small private choice when he wired the deposit, to convert a life-saving act into a properly recorded ledger entry. Now the ledger demanded further entries. He called a meeting of the compliance team. He asked the general counsel to open a formal inquiry and to engage outside auditors. He insisted that every communication be retained. Elaine reacted with predictable fury. She wrote emails asking why the matter had not been contained before it reached paper. She suggested quiet settlements. She pressed for more careful framing of public statements. When she could not control the trajectory, she lashed out in the only leverage she had left: reputation management. "We can correct this," she told Martin in a clipped voicemail. "We need to stop this becoming a story about constant vendors. We'll lose sponsors, partners. The board will want answers." The board indeed wanted answers. The word investigation carried a smell of danger for the executives who had prided themselves on smooth returns. The meeting convened under the lacquered table, with shareholders and compliance officers, legal teams, and a small, reluctant group of external auditors. Richard opened with the facts he had insisted be gathered: hospital confirmation, the deposit record, email threads, the vendor contract history. He did not frame his words as absolution. He spoke with a constrained honesty that unnerved more than it mollified. "If oversight failed," he said, "that failure starts here, with decisions delegated and not followed through." Some men at the table nodded, others shifted their gaze. A COO who had made a career of optimizing margins argued that vendor efficiency had been a legitimate strategic goal. A compliance officer presented a timeline of missed audits. It became, in the sterile way of corporate rooms, a tangle of memos and minutes. But that tangle had weight now, because it was tied to a woman whose life had nearly been erased in the hustle of other people's profits. Meanwhile, Elaine escalated in a different direction. She leaned on people she knew in the local press, offered discreet denials, and fed suggestive lines that shaped narratives. Isolated incident, no proof of systemic failure, we're cooperating fully. She tried to paint the event as unfortunate and private, something to be owned and closed. When that failed to dampen the noise because hospital records and worker statements were not easily bottled, she turned to subterfuge. A set of messages sent to unnamed employees, a suggestion that public testimonies could destroy livelihoods. The campaign had the odor of intimidation. Staff at the laundromat felt it in the new uncertainty. Some retracted their willingness to speak, fearful of retaliation. It was here that the third defining decision by Ava occurred. Where she could have retreated, she pressed forward. Claire connected her with a workers' rights group that specialized in protecting employees who spoke up. Ava agreed to sit for recorded interviews. She arranged for witnesses from the laundromat to submit statements. Some agreed to be anonymous for a time. She insisted, though, on legal oversight. The statements would be preserved, notarized where possible, and documented in a way that could withstand cross-examination. She insisted that any remediation be structural rather than cash-based. "I don't want a check," she told Claire. "I want a change." That insistence made her a target. Slips of anonymous threats arrived in her voicemail. A neighbor reported a man asking questions about her schedule outside the laundromat. A private investigator, hired, it later became clear, by someone with resources, appeared on social media, digging for any indiscretion to use as leverage. Claire and the legal team advised caution. They helped Ava secure temporary restraining measures against direct harassment and assisted in keeping records of threatening interactions. The pattern of pressure was clear: make the individual afraid enough to withdraw. Ava refused, not because fear had no place in her life, she knew it intimately, but because the calculus had shifted. The fight was not only for her mother's safety. It had started to be about whether other invisible people would remain invisible. She would not exchange her voice for silence. At this point, the company's internal inquiry began to generate formal artifacts: documented incidents forwarded to local regulatory agencies, a request from a state occupational safety office for interviews, and eventually, subpoenas directed to the laundromat and to the Hale Company. Martin had warned Richard that public records would emerge. The subpoenas changed the terms. The inquiry was no longer an internal PR problem. It was a legal process with teeth. The boardroom grew more crowded with external counsel and auditors. The pressure mounted from shareholders concerned with liability and brand. There was also a counter-pressure from parts of the company that wanted to do better, division heads who had read the audit and were disgusted by the gaps. Richard found himself squeezed between defense and reform, between preserving individual interests and accepting institutional responsibility. He moved haltingly toward the latter. He asked the board to place 2 executives on administrative leave while the inquiry proceeded. One of them, the operations vice president who had overseen vendor relations, protested bitterly. But the action signaled something. The company was willing to accept that negligence might exist at levels that required real personnel consequences. It did not assure any particular legal outcome, but it made the choices visible. Richard also authorized the appointment of an independent monitor to oversee vendor practices while auditors completed their review. The word independent mattered. He insisted on an outside party to avoid simple internal window dressing. Elaine saw him move and grew angrier. When containment failed to restore her sense of order, she struck at another point of leverage: narrative control. She worked quietly through friends within the company to push for a public statement that framed the incident as regrettable but contained. She wanted a message that absolved the Hale household of any systemic implication. Richard, however, had decided against containment framed by spin. He wrote a short public statement that acknowledged the company's duty to examine its vendor relationships, promised cooperation with the investigation, and, most uncomfortably for those who measured success in optics, accepted that the company might be found wanting. The statement did not absolve him. Within the company halls, some colleagues treated his words as betrayal. Others treated them as overdue honesty. For Richard, the act of acknowledgement had a cost. The board would question him more aggressively at the next convening. Share prices jittered. Editorial columns critiqued the timing of the statement and argued about leadership accountability. He felt the press of consequence the same way Ava had felt the pressure of midnight, an unavoidable accounting. Publicly, the story gained traction because of the meticulous records Claire and the legal team had amassed. The media, which feeds on narrative clarity, found a through line: worker exposure, ignored complaints, an employer's vendor ledger that disguised risk. Reporters requested interviews. Some ran with the story cautiously, others with the fervor of those who smelled scandal. Elaine attempted to counter with damage control, a carefully worded op-ed about philanthropy and corporate citizenship, and an attempt to paint Ava as a manipulated pawn. The attempt backfired in small ways because the documents were already in the hands of reporters and regulators. The formal hearings that followed were procedural and public in varying degrees. There were depositions, long dry afternoons where people read aloud from documents and answered whether certain phrases were attributed to them. There were regulatory interviews where compliance officers had to explain how audits had been scheduled and why they had not been completed. There were moments that carried the weight of slow justice. A rookie clerk in the vendor office who had filed a work order for a safety inspection and seen it ignored. A laundromat worker who had complained of chemical burns and had been told to toughen up by a manager. These testimonies were not cinematic. They were instead small, cumulative pressures that eroded the protection of plausible denial. Ava prepared for a hearing that would have the feeling of a formal public inventory. She met with counsel. She rehearsed what she would say into a recorder, making sure her statements were clear and anchored in facts. She did not rehearse rage. She rehearsed persistence. To people who asked why she would put herself through the process, she said simply, "Because someone has to stand here and say what it was like. If I don't do it, who will?" The hearing day arrived under a low December sun. Media vans lined the curb outside the hearing room, a modest parade that made the event feel larger than it was. Ava walked up the steps with the same deliberate gait she had used at the hospital. Her nerves hummed. She was tired but not broken. Richard sat in the audience, not in the front row, but in a place where he could see the testimony. He had, after careful counsel and against considerable advice, decided he would not hide. He had told Martin he would answer questions honestly and accept that whatever followed was the cost of having failed to ensure safety. On the stand, Ava spoke with the spare clarity that had guided her through the worst of the night in the Hale living room. She described shifts, machines, the way a manager's shrug felt like permission to shortcut safety. She read from memos she had been shown, a list of directives that had reduced protective gear allotments to a line item. And she described her mother's symptoms, the nights she had complained and the nights she had worked anyway. The transcript created a new kind of record. Elaine watched like someone watching a play she had not written. She sent no notes at that moment. Her expression was carved into the composure of those unused to being questioned. When it was over, the hearing adjourned, and the transcripts made their slow round through the offices of people whose job it was to turn words into remedies. Richard later testified himself. He did not stand in triumph nor in repentance for show. He answered questions about oversight, about vendor selection, and about whether he had paid sufficient attention to the gaps in the company's monitoring program. His admission was careful and not theatrical. "We did not meet the standards we set for ourselves," he said. It was a sentence that cost him frames of mind and the patience of colleagues, but it made the record truer. The legal process that followed was grinding. Motions, counter-motions, the negotiation of what evidence would be admissible. Out of the courtroom's slow machinery, though, procedural consequences emerged. The company agreed to a remediation plan with an independent monitor to review vendor contracts for a period of years, to fund training for workers at contracted sites, and to establish a hotline for safety complaints with real follow-up. Executives implicated in negligence were disciplined. Some took leaves of absence, others resigned. None of this was instantaneous retribution. It was instead a rearrangement of structures. The regulatory office imposed requirements for corrective action and oversight, and a non-profit watchdog was designated to assess compliance over time. Elaine reacted by escalating in personal ways: attacks on Richard's leadership, pressure behind closed doors, attempts to spin the story into a tale of personal failure rather than institutional oversight. She sent a last-ditch proposal to Ava with more money and stricter NDAs and with legal threats tethered to the offer. Ava refused firmly, with Claire there beside her to ensure any counteroffer would not be coercive. There were personal costs. Ava received fewer job offers for housework because some employers feared controversy. Friends said it was dangerous to be visible. Richard suffered reputational damage and a fracturing boardroom. Shareholders were restless. The company's stock took bruises as the market digested the idea that governance could mean real cost. Martin Lewis, who had warned of publicity's perils, found himself advising damage control while negotiating the terms of the company's remediation. He told Richard bluntly that stepping down might be the most responsible move to preserve the company's ability to reform. It was one of the hardest choices Richard had to make: to accept personal consequence in order to avoid becoming the scapegoat for a system he had allowed to calcify. In a small, tightly scheduled meeting, Richard told the board he planned to resign as CEO to take part of the responsibility publicly and to create space for reforms to proceed without the distraction of a single executive's persona. The board debated, some balking at the optics of a CEO fall, others insisting accountability must be visible. He wrote a brief statement acknowledging leadership failures, pledging to cooperate with oversight, and offering his resignation to take effect once the company had put in place a permanent oversight structure. It was not a theatrical confession. It was an admission with a practical purpose: to free the institution to be remade. When he made the announcement publicly, the language was sober. He did not seek absolution. He said, "We did not do enough to protect those who work to keep us functioning. For that, I am sorry, and I will accept the consequences." The words were small and exact. They did not magically restore the months of lost health or erase the strain Ava's mother had endured. They did, however, set a public and concrete accounting that the company could not easily rewrite. For Ava, the procedural victories were tempered by the reality of slow implementation. The laundromat's manager was replaced. The business agreed to safety training and to a unionization consult. Regulators required periodic reporting. A remediation fund was established to pay for care and safety retrofits at similar sites. None of it constituted immediate justice in a cinematic sense. No dramatic courtroom confession, no sudden closure. But it changed the institutional incentives that had allowed harm to persist. Elaine, isolated further by the public record, retreated into a defensive media posture. She sent out statements about charitable initiatives and called for solutions led by experts. Her attempts to exert private pressure ebbed against the tide of documented facts. Some of her allies in the company distanced themselves. Those who had argued for containment found their arguments less defensible in the face of audited evidence. Ava's mother's recovery was slow and steady. The scars were not just physical but administrative. Insurance claims to sort, home health aides to schedule, appeals to make. The couple of weeks in the hospital turned into months of careful physiotherapy. Ava learned new routines, lifts at home, medication schedules, home visits from nurses. It was exhausting, but it was work that created a new normal. As the institutional machinery ground toward remediation, a quieter, more enduring project took shape. A foundation funded in part by the company, designed to support oversight of vendors and to provide education and resources to workers in hazardous contracted jobs. This was the part Ava insisted on shaping. She refused any token role. She insisted those most impacted have a seat at the table. "If you want the work to be real," she told the foundation's interim directors, "put workers on the board. Don't just talk about consultation. Give power." The final charter of the foundation included a worker advisory council with voting rights on grant allocations, a clear mandate to fund independent safety audits, and a hotline staffed by third-party advocates to ensure whistleblowers could report without fear of reprisal. Richard, who had signed off on the funding, did not ask to be the figurehead. He preferred to be a guarantor, an uncomfortable but practical role, providing funds while ceding control to independent trustees and the Worker Council. He agreed publicly to cooperate with regulators and to step back from operational leadership. The personal reconciliation between Ava and the Hale household's institutions was limited and honest. She accepted nothing that erased her dignity. She turned down offers to appear at corporate PR events. She sat instead in a small meeting room with a community organizer, Claire Evans, and a handful of laundromat workers to map out what would make their environments safer. She agreed to serve on the foundation's advisory council, not as a figurehead, but to voice the concerns of workers. She did not want to be tokenized. She wanted policy. The cost of truth had been real. Some friends misunderstood her refusal to take hush money. Some donors to the foundation were skeptical about worker-led decisions. Elaine privately tried to undermine Ava's credibility by suggesting she had been manipulated. Those attempts failed to take root because of the careful documentation and witnesses who had stepped forward despite intimidation. The record by then had become the anchor. The quieter moments after the upheaval were where the human work happened. Ava learned to sleep when she could. She listened to her mother's small victories, one less oxygen tank day, a step without a brace. They spoke of practical things: how to budget rehab, how to apply for additional assistance programs. Friends from the laundromat pooled together to help with rides and meals. There were days when the small gestures, someone bringing soup, a neighbor fixing a broken shelf, felt as crucial as any corporate remediation. Richard, now no longer the CEO, found his days emptied of certain kinds of meetings and filled with another kind of labor, showing up to oversight sessions, testifying at hearings, setting up the foundation's governance. He had to answer uncomfortable questions about why he had not seen the memos, why the oversight had been lax. His resignation did not erase public scrutiny, but it made room for other leaders to build different cultures. He kept his presence minimal, purposeful, a man making reparations in pragmatic steps, not in theater. There were moments of real fragility. Elaine, intent on reclaiming narrative control, initiated legal attempts to limit some of the company's disclosures in the name of privacy. She pushed for settlements with individual employees while resisting systemic change. Those attempts created friction and required further negotiation. They did not derail the core reforms because the record and regulatory action had hardened into formal requirements. The lessons of process kept revealing themselves. A full remediation plan takes years, not months. Independent monitors must be paid and given real authority. Worker councils need training and legal backing. Ava learned the language of governance. How to read board minutes. How to suggest policy language that would not be swallowed by corporate lawyer speak. She gained allies in small, reliable ways. A union organizer who taught her to file grievances, a labor lawyer who explained how to protect witnesses, a local council member who helped push for stronger enforcement of safety rules. The cost to Ava was not only bureaucratic. There were nights she woke, heart pounding as if the Hale House's hush still clung to her. The humiliation had left a small bruise under her skin that took time to fade. Her mother, who had always been stoic, sometimes wept at the memory of pain. But there were also moments of luminous ordinariness. Her mother making coffee again, the two of them laughing about some small domestic absurdity. The neighbor kid teaching Ava's mother a new app to play songs that made her smile. In the community center that the foundation helped fund for worker education, Ava taught a small class on workers' rights and basic first aid. She found the work steadying. People listened when she spoke, other women who had been told to accept things because they were how it was. They brought their stories. She taught them how to document incidents, how to talk to a social worker, how to claim their records. It felt less like heroism and more like workmanship, arduous, necessary craftsmanship that slowly, insistently reshaped the world. The company's monitoring reports came in public and private form. Some months showed progress, updated supplier contracts, documented safety training sessions, improved PPE provisions. Other months were uneven, complications of rollout and resistance inside departments. Still, the independent monitor's quarterly reports had teeth. Corrective actions were publicly logged and compliance checks were not perfunctory. The laundromat was cited for failures and required to make changes. Ventilation upgrades, new training, formal incident response protocols. It was not a complete exoneration of the past, but it was a reconfiguration of future risk. Elaine retreated from public view. The hush she sought had evaporated, and the notion of quiet control lost its charm when it could not alter policies. Privately, she took counsel from advisors who argued for a new philanthropic posture, trying to pivot from defense to visible community work. But the pivot felt cosmetic to those who had been harmed. Change had to be structural to count. At a small event marking the foundation's first year, Claire stood at the microphone and read letters from workers who had benefited from safety training. A woman who had once been too afraid to name a supervisor smiled as the crowd applauded a small grant that allowed her to take a certification course. Ava, sitting in the third row, felt a loose disbelief, the sensation of seeing something she had helped begin and finding it real. After the event, a volunteer handed Ava a printed copy of a message that had been circulating among community groups, a note of support from people who had followed her story. One line had been texted to her by someone she did not know. "You stood up and we saw it." Ava folded the paper and put it in her pocket like a small talisman. Her mother regained enough strength to walk to the porch and sit in the morning light. There were still appointments and bills and slow improvements, but the horizon had a steadier line. The hospital visits decreased. They began to talk in the evening about the future, not as a list of needs, but as a set of possibilities. Part-time work that would not demand long nights, a neighbor who could help with errands, the small idea of a garden that her mother wanted to start. Richard, having left his operational role, continued to fund the foundation and attended oversight meetings as required, but he gave up the public face of leadership. When he spoke in those meetings, he spoke with the tone of someone who had been schooled in the cost of oversight. He accepted that his role would be to listen and to ensure the foundation did not become a public relations vehicle. Ava's final choices in the arc were quiet but decisive. She accepted a seat on the Foundation's Worker Advisory Council. She refused any paid position that would have turned her into an emblem. Instead, she negotiated terms that ensured workers would have binding votes on allocation and programming. She met with the independent monitor and suggested specific language for accountability, periodic audits, whistleblower protections, and an annual public report with metrics that mattered to workers, not just to investors. When the first annual report was released, it included the numbers and the narratives. It listed supplier audits, training hours, and, crucially, the stories of workers who had been able to access care. It did not claim perfection. It showed an evolving set of practices and listed the missteps as well as the improvements. That kind of honesty made it easier for the community to trust the process. The hush of the Hale House, the idea that one could smooth things over with money and silence, was no longer the defining note. The ledger had become more complicated. It listed harm and remediation, names and actions. It had also, in a way, restored a small piece of dignity to Ava and to other workers. She had insisted that the record show their names. On a crisp evening some months later, Ava folded a stack of freshly laundered shirts in the small, neat space of the community center. The sun was low, casting long panes of gold across linoleum. A woman from the laundromat brought in a thermos of coffee and set it beside her. They paused, hands busy, and looked at each other without the old paraphernalia of deference or pity. Ava's phone buzzed. It was from an unknown number. For a moment she hesitated. For a while she had expected intimidation. She nearly let it go. Then she read the message. "We saw you. Keep going. If you need anything, call." She smiled the kind of smile that carries both weariness and resolve. She typed back with an economy she knew well. "We will." Then she stood, carrying the stack of shirts to the shelf, and stepped outside into the street. The evening was ordinary and full of possibility. The neighborhood children chasing a ball, a bus letting off late commuters, a neighbor hammering a loose nail. She felt her chest loosen in a way that was not the end of the story, but a recognition that certain things could be different from here on. Ava had asked for a loan to save one life. She had received what she needed at midnight, but what followed was not a neat ending. It was a long, procedural, often unglamorous series of choices: to document, to insist, to refuse silence, and to help redesign the systems that had permitted harm. The cost had been personal and public. The change was not total, but it was durable in the precise ways that matter: policies, boards with worker voices, independent oversight, and a community that had learned to demand being counted. Richard's stunned reaction in the living room had been the beginning of a chain that forced reckoning. He had been altered not into a savior but into someone accountable, a man who took notation and consequence in stride. Elaine's attempts at containment and control had failed to erase the record. The laundromat had been forced to reform in ways that required real time and expense. The Foundation, imperfect as it was, offered a means for sustained change. The last image is small. Ava, folding laundry, mother's voice calling from the kitchen as she tests a new recipe, the Foundation's meeting minutes spread on the table beside a stack of hospital forms that once threatened to swallow a life. Ava looked out at the evening and thought of all the people who might now be protected by the work she had helped begin. She folded the last shirt, placed it on the shelf, and let the steady sound of the neighborhood fill the space. She had asked for something urgent and life-saving in a moment of need. That request had surprised a billionaire and set in motion a long, necessary work. It would not be the end of the world's injustices, but it was the kind of beginning that might make them a little harder to sustain. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be seen. When the day ended, Ava and her mother sat by the window and watched a bus pass with the glint of city lights. The bruise on Ava's wrist had faded to a pale memory. Her mother, now stronger, leaned into her daughter and whispered, "You did not let us disappear." Ava pressed her forehead to hers, a small, tired acknowledgement. They had not disappeared. They had created records, witnesses, and a steady insistence that would not be satisfied with easy fixes. The future was uncertain, as it always is. There would be more hearings, more audits, more tests of resolve. But there were also new structures, A foundation with teeth, worker seats at oversight tables, audits that could not be ignored. Ava had become a different kind of person, still practical, still cautious, but also someone who had learned how to ask for more than survival, for dignity, for accountability, for a world where a deposit did not decide a life. She folded the last of the laundry, turned off the lamp, and watched the street empty gently. The night was not silent. It held instead a steady promise. They would not be invisible again. The phone buzzed once more, this time with a number she recognized, Claire, asking if she could come to a planning meeting. Ava answered and agreed. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, two women, mother and daughter, prepared for whatever came next, together. The ledger of the night had been altered. The work that followed would keep it honest.